Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final installment of our Fall Book Talk series, featuring author Rabbi Gidon Rothstein. Rabbi Rothstein lives in Israel, where he teaches Torah and writes online articles. He'll talk more about that when he begins. This is his seventh book. During the presentation, you are encouraged to write questions and comments in the chat. They will be addressed afterwards. And if we have time, we will entertain live questions and answers. Welcome, Rabbi Rothstein.
Thank you so much, Shalom. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you here. I mean, I'm happy to be in the United States right now, so it's particularly convenient for me. And I appreciate the opportunity because, when I take on projects, they matter to me, and I take them on for reasons that are significant to me. So here's the book, in case you don't have it yet, in case you're thinking about looking at for it. It's called Judaism of the Poskim, Responsa and the Nature of Orthodox Judaism. So I think somebody else came up with that title in the process of my publishing it, but the point of the book, it started with the following questions that I had for myself. I wanted to a few things came together. One was I didn't know a lot about Responsa. I had seen a few Responsa here and there over my time in trying to study Torah, but I really didn't know many Responsa at all. I wanted to try to educate myself. That was one sort of back burner issue. A second issue, and this was already getting more significant to me, is that I think that there should be other options for daily Torah study than just Daf Yomi. I learned a Daf Yomi now. I learned with very dedicated people who I admire and respect greatly. But I thought there are other things that people could be learning daily. And I was trying to think of what would be a daily learning that could be productive for people. And I thought to myself, there's this world of Chuvot, there's this world of Responsa. And what if you had a Responsa to study each day? So how do you figure out a response to study each day? So I said to myself, well, what if I found the responsum written on that day? Meaning the date on the responsum would be, let's say today, tonight, tomorrow was the 9th of Kislev. So I said, what if I search, I have a Barilan. What if I search in my Barilan for a responsum written on the 9th of Kislev? And I did that for throughout the year. So you have a year's worth of responsa written on the particular day. So I thought that was an interesting thing to do. And so I did it, and you have it in the chat box in front of you. I did it. The OU has always been very nice to me. They helped me be part of their Nachyomi project. And then I suggested this to their director of education at the time. I think he's still there, Rabbi Jack Abramowitz. And he said, we'd love to host it. So the audio stream are there at the OU website. I think I put the link in here in the chat box. If you search for ou.org and a responsum a day, there's an audio shiur for every day of the calendar, with some exceptions, right? So the truth is, I would have thought to myself, I wouldn't find the responsum written for the 10th of Kislev because it's Yom Kippur, and you're not going to write a responsum on the 10th of Kislev. But it happens to be towards the end of his life, the Tzitz Eliezer, Rabbi Yehuda, Eliezer Yehuda Waldenberg, recorded some of his Kol Nidre drushos in his book as a response. So he wrote them down afterwards, but that was a convenient way to do it. So I just like this idea that there's a piece of Torah that you can study and learn on the anniversary of the day that was written. So that was something that sort of pushed me to this project. And I thought to myself, once I get this all together, I bet something interesting will happen, because it happens to be that I have this sort of deep and I don't know why, unfounded belief. I don't know if it's unfounded, I think it's true, that if you gather a bunch of Torah together, there's these underlying commonalities. There are these underlying joint things. So, for example, this is an easy one, right? You put together a whole bunch of responsa, they're all going to believe in God. But more significant than that is something I was looking for, right? What are the things that are common to these books of responsa, to these writers of responsa? So, and I had been thinking of that for a while because a previous book I had written, the first nonfiction book that I wrote of Jewish nature was called "We're Missing the Point," and that was a book also that started with this basic idea of what could be a version of Judaism that we all want to try to figure that we all agree with. Right. So I thought originally to try to find a version that we could agree with, like across the denominational lines. That I don't think I found. But I did think in the book that I wrote that I found something that Jews should agree, Orthodox Jews should agree, should characterize their Orthodox Judaism. That was that book. Now I was interested in if you gather a bunch of responsa without any particular, program in gathering them. Meaning, theoretically, I was just taking a response from that day that I found interesting and that I found productive. And then the question would be, once I was done with all of that, what would it produce? Right? Those were, I think, the three things that I put together. The goal, the idea of getting to know response a little bit better, because there's this important piece of Jewish literature that I felt personally, and I think many other people probably are less familiar with, right? You don't grow up in school, you see a few Mishnayos in school, depending where you go to school, Yeshiva, right? Or seminary, wherever you go, you see some Gemaras, but the idea that you see a Responsa, that doesn't come up as much. So that was one question. Learn some Responsa. Second question, find a daily piece of learning that would be productive. So it's a half hour. If somebody wants to, in a half hour, listen to a shiur for a half hour, they get a response under their belt in about a half hour. It's a daily piece of learning throughout a year. You get a whole collection of responses to learn from. And then the question of what links or what unifies, what joins them all. So that's where the roots of this book were settled. The truth is, when I started, I originally thought maybe I would publish the summaries of all of the responses, but that would have been that would have been a lot, right? It just takes a lot of space. So that I didn't eventually publish. They're all online. You can find those out also. Many of them are at TorahMusings.com, which is a website run by Rabbi Gil Student, who publishes me twice a week. So I certainly owe him a debt of gratitude. But I put many of the summaries are there as well in writing. If you don't want to do a share, they're there as well. So what do you learn though? What do you get out of the project like this? What do I get? And then what do I hope that I convey to you that you get? So one of the elements to think about is that responsa are written by people who have an expertise in Jewish law and halacha. They know enough literature that they feel comfortable writing. But what's interesting is there's a wide disparity in the ways that they quote things. Right? So you have to know a lot to write a book of response. I mean, ideally, you should know a lot to write a book of responsa. But some people know more, some people know less. So you can write it or not write it. But if I had to ask you to guess, like, who knew the most, or who do we know of as being somebody who had a phenomenal knowledge of Jewish literature, of Jewish books, of halachic books? So there's a name out there. I'll come to it in a second. I'm trying to give you a chance to chat in if you want to. But there are other people who also know a lot, but clearly don't need to know as much as that person. And yet they are well recognized and well accepted respondents and well accepted sources of halacha. So in my favorite contrast, and your chance to write it in the chat box is quickly dwindling. In my favorite contrast, I think that if you look at the difference between Rav Ovadia Yosef's tshuvot and the tshuvot of Rabbi Yosef and the tshuvot of Rav Moshe Feinstein. I think that you find this, my chat box just appeared, there you go. I think you find this very interesting contrast between them in that Rabbi Yosef quotes a tremendous amount, as opposed to Chacham Ovadia quotes a lot more exactly. So Chacham Ovadia, very good. So Chacham Ovadia quotes a great deal, but Moshe Feinstein quotes more sparingly. He quotes, right? But he quotes more sparingly. He doesn't seem to have used nearly as extensive a library as Rabbi Yosef did. And yet, if I said to you, who's the more authoritative respondent, right? I think you would say they're pretty much equally authoritative. If I told you, well, Ravadia holds this way and Ramosh holds this way, I don't think we would say, oh, clearly Ravadia wins. So that's something that I thought was interesting to sort of just begin to get a sense of, an understanding of. We have these figures, and the response in the books they tilt towards the 20th century, and they tilt to the 20th century because the idea of dating tshuvot, right, of writing the date that you're writing on, isn't an obvious idea. Already in the Gemara, you have the idea of dating things that you're doing, right? We already have that idea in the Gemara for sure. But nonetheless, it wasn't clear that you would date documents that you're writing, letters that you're writing, that you don't have as much. So the earliest tshuvot that I ended up using were from 1600, when the Bach has a few tshuvot that he dates. The Bach is an important commentary on the Tur, which was the major work of halacha until the Shulchan Aruch came along, right? So the Tur is written in the early 1300s, and the Bach is living in the late 1500s, early 1600s. But the Shulchan Aruch, which was published in 1565, does not yet have the authority to see it, the authority that it eventually has. So the Bach writes on the Tur. He also has tshuvot, so he dated some of his tshuvot. But many of my tshuvot were from the 20th century. For that reason, that's why some reviewers of the book have said, don't think you're going to get a picture of the Responsa literature in general here, because it's only the people who wrote dates on their tshuvot, and it's tilted to the 20th century, and all of that might be. I'm sorry. So the Tur is the son of was the son of the Rosh. Sorry, let's try it this way. The Rosh is an important Rishon, is an important early authority. The Rosh is born in and grows up in Germany, and he's from the Tosafist school. He's at the end of the Tosafist school, and then towards the end of his life, he moved to Spain, and he becomes a rabbi in Spain, a well-respected rabbi in Spain, and so that's the Rosh. He has a son whose name was Yaakov. He has a few sons. One of his sons actually died in the Black Plague, but he has a son named Yaakov Balaturim who writes this book called the Tur, Arba'at Turim, and that's the model for the Shulchan Aruch. That's the form, meaning the Shulchan Aruch that we use, the code of Jewish law that we use, that was written by Rav Yosef Karo in the late 1500s, used the exact same structure as the Tur from the early 1300s. He just wrote it more concisely in the Shulchan Aruch, and he put it into paragraphs and things like that. And there were some significant changes, but the structure of the work that we call Shulchan Aruch really came from the Tur. So the Tur, when it's written in the 1300s, becomes this important halachic work because it summarizes and puts together in easy chapter form important halachic issues like we have in the Shulchan Aruch that we still use today. So around the Tur, there were commentaries that were written. Probably the best known commentary that was written is called the Beit Yosef, and that's by Rav Yosef Karo, who was the author in the 1500s of the Shulchan Aruch. Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, which is a shorter, a more concise form than the Tur. And then he went back, I'm pretty sure he went back later, he decided to give the whole background, and the Beit Yosef gives like the whole discussion in the Rishonim that the Tur was presenting extremely concisely. So the Tur is this work. The Bach is another commentary. The Bach is basically a contemporary of the Shulchan Aruch. He writes his commentary on the Tur as well, and it's called the Bayit Chadash, and that's what you have. So I came to that because he was the earliest of the Responsa that I have in the early 1600s. And then I have Responsa to go up, I think, to the year 2000. But many of the Responsa are from the 20th century, particularly. So I don't have a chart of the meshivim. So if somebody asked me in the chat box, do I have a chart of the meshivim so we can see how they're all intertwined? I don't have a chart of them in terms of their years. I didn't do that. But in the back of the book, I do have the list of Responsa by calendar. And then I have also by calendar date. And then I have the years of the Responsa. And I have who the meshivim are with how many Responsa they get. Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't remember that I did this. I have at the back of the book, I have a section called Appendix D, brief biographies of the respondents, listed by the number of Responsa of theirs that I took. So I have that. I don't have it in the chart, but I have like the respondents in the descending order of the number of tshuvot that I took from them. And for each respondent, I have a mini biography, which I mostly took from the Bar Ilan's mini biographies that they do in the Bar Ilan Responsa. So, but to give a sense of it, I have 81 Responsa that were from Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I'll confess, the truth is, I didn't want to get so caught up in one respondent. If you think about it, how many Responsa there are in the book, how many days are there in the Jewish calendar year? So we're primed to say 354, right? Because people know that there's fewer days in the Jewish calendar than there are in the solar calendar. And that's true in many years. True, there's in some years 355 because you can have, or 353 because you can have the months of Cheshvan and Kislev can each have a 1 day or 2 day Rosh Chodesh at the end. That's one thing. But then 7 times out of every 19 years, we add another 30 days. So the truth is there are 384 possible days in the Jewish calendar, 385 possible in the Jewish calendar. So, but 81 of them for Moshe Feinstein. So one of the things that I discovered, I would not have known until I did this project, is that Moshe Feinstein, aside from everything else, was an excellent writer. His tshuvot, and once you're going through tshuvot, I won't name the people on the other side. Once you're going through a bunch of tshuvot, you see that some people, even though they all know a lot, and that's not what distinguishes one set of tshuvot from another. It's not really the amount of knowledge, because unless you have a certain level of knowledge, you're not going to write tshuvot to begin with. What distinguishes them are things like the clarity of thought, and that certainly comes up as an issue. So Moshe Feinstein thinks he doesn't need me to say so. I'm just pointing out there are other tshuvot I'm leaving unnamed where it's not as true. His thought is very clear and his writing is very clear. It's extremely easy to follow. So it's just very convenient. It's very tempting to use it. And then other tshuvot, and a bunch of other respondents that you have in this situation. So that's how the book came together. So what did I do? So I first spent a bunch of time, because it takes time, right? So I wrote summaries of each of the tshuvot, and then I did an audio shear of each of the tshuvot. And then once I had those summaries together, I started trying to think about how do you see running themes among them? So it ended up being, and this is one of the reasons why some people who review the book say, but you can't assume that this tells you anything about Judaism in general, which may be fine, but I'll tell you this. I have the top 5 respondents that I have. Right, the top 5 people whose response I took were Moshe Feinstein, who was Moshe Feinstein. I don't know that we have to say much more about him. He was born in Russia in the late 1800s. He moved to the U.S. in 1937, and then he was in America for the next 40 years, 45 years, writing tshuvot voluminously, answering tremendous numbers of questions in ways that people found productive. I have a lot of tshuvot also from the Tzitz Eliezer, who I found to be somebody whose writing I enjoyed greatly, whose mode of thinking I enjoyed greatly. So he was born in 1916, and he's right around the same time. There's like a generation of rabbis who are born or grew up in Jerusalem. So Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, was 6 years older than Tzitz Eliezer. I didn't use so many of his tshuvot just because he doesn't date as many of his tshuvot as far as I could tell. And then Rabbi Yosef was born in 1920, right? So that's just a few years later. He wasn't born in Jerusalem, but he gets to Jerusalem at a relatively young age. And then you have others who were born, and one of the things that's remarkable about them is that if you read through their tshuvot, especially if they review Rabbi Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer, Tzitz Eliezer doesn't quote as widely as Rabbi Yosef quotes, but they quote Sfarim. So this isn't the marker, I suppose, but it was just something that noticeable to me. They quote Sfarim I'd never heard of. Not I'd never learned. That's easy, right? But Sfarim, they quote books I really never heard of, and I spend a lot of time like trying to hear, learn about books, and and remember that they're living before the internet, which means that growing up in Jerusalem in the yeshivos, they had access to a breadth of literature that I wouldn't have known about, right? And so it actually in the last few weeks, somebody pointed out to me that Eichel Shlomo, I think it was that now it's an Eichel Shlomo, that the library of the Encyclopedia Talmudit, you had this library with like 30,000 volumes. They've gotten rid of some of the volumes now because they need more space and nobody uses books anymore. But just that idea, I thought was very interesting. And then, one of the surprises of this project was that I encountered the Chasam Sofer. So, you grew up in a certain world. In my world, I didn't learn that many Achronim on Gemara. I just didn't for whatever reasons. I'm not saying that with any pride. I'm saying it happens to be. So I wouldn't have found the Chasam Sofer that way. But when I started this project, I started looking for tshuvot with dates on them. I encountered the Chasam Sofer. I would start saying to myself, let me look. And he also, again, doesn't need my ratification, but he also is one of these people who writes very clearly and in a way that's very well thought out. Meaning, I guess in the world that I grew up in, I could hear about the Chasam Sofer in positions that people quoted in his name that might sound to me sort of not the way I would necessarily see the world. And yet when you learn his tshuvot, it's not so clear at all, right? So that's another one of the meshivim, was one of my top 5 meshivim. Another example of somebody that I got to know a little bit and felt good about getting to know was Rav Uziel, Rav Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel. He was a colleague of Rav Kook's, who we'll talk about in just a second. So he was a colleague of Rav Kook's in Yafo, Tel Aviv, Yafo, and then they were both chief rabbis. Rav Kook passed away before the state started, but they were both chief rabbis of Israel at the same time. And then he was the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, Rav Herzog. Did many important things in terms of trying to shape the religious character of the state of Israel. And again, has these very interesting, fascinating tshuvot. Not one that I'm going to talk about tonight, but for a week from now is the 16th of Kislev, which happens to be the yahrzeit of my father-in-law, Avram Yitzchak ben Yisrael Zev, alav shalom. Happens to be that for that date, the tshuva that I found was about eating kitniyot on Pesach. So somebody wrote to Rav Uziel. They wrote in 1915 and 1917 about whether, because of World War I and the economic troubles sort of created and developed by World War One, could they eat kitniot? So he goes through a whole discussion, and it happens to be, spoiler alert, so if you don't want to hear it, I apologize, but in 1915, he thought that the needs weren't great enough to allow kitniot, to allow eating legumes and those things that we don't generally eat on Pesach. Yeah, and he didn't think it would solve the problem either, because the kind of kitniot that they had around were going to be basically vegetables. They weren't going to let people have like a staple of their diet. So he didn't allow it. And in 1917, he did allow it. So what's remarkable about that is I've given you enough clues. So I want you to think about that. What is odd about the tshuva that I just mentioned very, very briefly? I'll come back to that in a second. So that's Rav Uziel, who is this. And then Rav Yosef also has, Rav Yosef has these great tshuvot that I also use. I mentioned those five names because when I was trying to put the book together, trying to figure out how do you find sort of commonalities and themes that characterize the response as a whole. Problem is, if you have five respondents who are represented in much greater numbers than other respondents, so maybe they're going to tip things towards their point of view. Meaning, if really I'm going to tell you, I think basically the respondents all agree on these propositions, whatever they may be, right? But it turns out that that's what Moshe Feinstein cared about, and I had enough Moshe Feinstein tshuvot in there that it tipped the whole balance to it. So that was going to be a problem. So what I did in the book was first I took each of those five most important respondents, and I looked at the themes that I discovered just in the tshuvot that I had for themselves, and then I compared it to the rest of the book and the rest of the thing. One could argue two approaches to kitnios later in Israel. It's true. You can have lots of approaches to eating kitnios in Israel. The thing that struck me most about it, though, was that nowhere in his tshuvot, and he consulted, this is World War I, so he was not yet the chief rabbi. He consulted with the then chief rabbi of Israel, Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, because at that time there was no Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. The position of Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, which was known as the Chacham Bashi, goes back hundreds of years, centuries, because the Ottoman Turks had a Chacham Bashi. They appointed, it was like an appointment to have a chief rabbi. There was no Ashkenazi chief rabbi until Rav Kook took the position. But what's interesting to me about the tshuva is that nowhere in the tshuva, nowhere in the responsa, does Rav Uziel say, what do you mean? We're Sephardim. We eat kitniot on Pesach. I grew up in a world where Sephardim ate kitniot on Pesach. And Rav Uziel entertains the question, discusses it the back and forth, does not ever consider that issue. I thought it was fascinating. These are like the fascinating things that you sort of pick up along the way as you're doing it, like the dividends of doing a project like this. So here's where I am in writing the book. I've got these five major respondents. So I gave each of them a chapter. I'm not going to give you the conclusions, but I gave each of them a chapter. And then after that, I looked at the tshuvot and I tried to figure out overall what were the themes of it. And so, God willing, you'll read the book and you'll see themes that come up that I wouldn't have thought necessarily were the major themes you'd find in Responsa. And that's what I thought was interesting. So I thought it was this. So I think it's this interesting idea that I maybe will continue to pursue, of seeing a unity where you could easily just see dispute and difference. I will say, just because it's worth saying here and saying wherever you can, one of the things about Rav Uziel that I thought was very interesting and also important, Rav Uziel more than once would say that, well, we can't have a Sanhedrin yet. That was the whole question. When you restarted the state of Israel, people started saying, maybe we can have the Sanhedrin start again. So Rav Uziel was clearly, you can't have a Sanhedrin start again because there are things that we need to have a Sanhedrin that we don't have yet. But he said, but we should have a conference of rabbis of Israel, like have all the rabbis get together, have them discuss issues, and come to joint decisions that will obligate the broad spectrum of those who follow rabbis, basically Orthodox Jews. Never happened. And I find that, first of all, I find it sad, but I also find it very important, especially in our times. And this is something that I've been thinking about in our times a lot. I've thought about it before our times, but in our time, when people talk about achdut, they talk about unity, which is a very valuable thing. And the more unity we can get, the better it is. But I would just point out that Rav Uziel was pointing out that achdut means we get together, we talk about issues where we don't agree, and we find some kind of a joint arrangement where we don't agree, where we can live with it together. and we live with it together, and that creates greater unity, even though it means that I have to give up some of my perspective, you have to give up some of your perspective. We find something in the middle. Here's a really interesting example that came up in the Yeshiva that I have in the book. We're going to famous as the original Tikkun was only to the Chutz not Israel. They just brought their own many rabbis. The other idea is that nowadays there can be seen as a move of halacha. Right, it could be right. Okay, so so here's an interesting thing. In the early 1950s, Rav Uziel and Rav Herzog, the chief rabbis of Israel, agreed that it would be better for the state of Israel if nobody did Yibum. So Yibum is in this tragic situation where a man passed away without children. So his widow is supposed to either marry a brother-in-law or have chalitza with a brother-in-law. For centuries, the Ashkenazi custom was to not marry, to not perform Yibum for various reasons that are not our topic tonight. The Sephardic custom was that if the couple wanted to perform Yibum, they wanted to marry because they thought for the sake of the mitzvah, because they wanted to fulfill the mitzvah, you allow them to do so. That's a well-known thing. Rav Uziel on that instance was saying that he thought for the health of the state of Israel, it was better if Sephardim forewent their custom. And as somebody said to me in the chat box, right, that's a good point. One of the things that bothered Rabbi Yosef was that he thought that Sephardi halacha had been suppressed. I'm not sure if Kitniot is an example of that. Maybe it is, but he thought that Sephardi halacha had been suppressed and wasn't being followed, and it bothered Rabbi Yosef greatly enough that in the early 1970s, when Rabbi Yosef was serving as Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, who was a man named Rabbi Frankel, who happens to be the father-in-law of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who used to be the Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel. So this is an Ashkenazic rabbi in Tel Aviv, approached Rabbi Yosef. A Sephardi couple had come to him. They wanted to perform Yibum, right? The woman was a widow, her husband passed away without children. The brother wants to marry, they want to fulfill the mitzvah. What should he tell them? And Rabbi Yosef, now remember, who is sitting in the job that was the job of the man who had said or had agreed that Sephardim would no longer perform Yibum in the state of Israel. He says, it's not true. We don't do that. So as again, somebody said to me in the chat box, as I don't say names when I'm doing recorded things, but as somebody said to me in the chat box, Rabbi Yosef was part of trying to rejuvenate and trying to breathe new life into the Sephardic practice of halacha. I would just point out that is, you can talk about when, where, and how, but that's a challenge for Achdu. Rabbi Uziel was thinking after this. So all of that is sort of some of the issues that came up. But one last issue that I wanted to bring up with you, and then because it was also something that it could be the difference of grounded in politics. Somebody else said that to me, that maybe that right. It could be that's true. I'm not really great on the policy. It could be that's true. There was certainly politics involved there as well. I agree. But I also wanted to briefly point out to you a tshuva that would have been today's tshuva. By today's tshuva, I mean that tonight is the 9th of Kislev. So I just put together for you, this is my summary, and I'm not going to read the whole thing at all with you. You can find it online, but my summary of a tshuva that was dated on the 9th of Kislev. So I'll talk about it in a second about the tshuva, but it is a tshuva written by Rav Kook, right? So this is in Dad Kohen, number 18. It's written on the 9th of Kislev of 5690, 1929. So before I do that, I just want to say something that was a shock to me. When I'm growing up in yeshiva, you talk about Rav Kook, so people talk about Rav Kook, they often mean Rav Kook's more, theological and philosophical writings. And so tried to read some of those over the years, and I found them very difficult. I've read, more since, and some of that was my ignorance, but it's also true that Rav Kook in those writings is trying to build a world that's not so clear. And he's a very revolutionary thinker. Right? He's got very new and ideas that have not been said before in quite that way. So he's struggling to express himself. I always find the reading very difficult. And to some extent, I'm talking about me rather than about Rav Kook, but to some extent, in trying to read them, I sort of felt like if he couldn't write in a way that I could figure out that was understandable, there must be some problem there. Could be right, could be wrong, I have no idea. But here's what I do know. When I started reading some of his tshuvot, there aren't that many in the book that I found that I used for various reasons, but when I started reading them, what's remarkable about them is how different they are in that they are written so clearly and with such an easy mastery of halachic literature, meaning I had heard the reports that Rav Kook was a genius and a giant in Torah and all this. But you read the theological writings, you read the philosophical writings, it doesn't come out because he's not quoting widely. He's telling you these new ideas that he has on his own. You read his chivot, you read his response, and all of a sudden you see a whole different person. It's somebody with a complete mastery of the halachic literature that he's using. He doesn't quote like Rabbi Yosef quotes. Nobody quotes like Rabbi Yosef quotes, but he's quoting, well enough that you see he knows much more than enough to have the right to be possibly halacha, to be arguing, to be ruling on halachic issues, and he's writing extremely clearly as well. It's well ordered thinking. It's not like just thoughts all over the place. It's put well together. So it was a fascinating sort of experience to have. So I'll just close with by close, I'll close my presentation, and then you can ask questions if you want to. With the piece here, this is the tshuva for the 9th of Kislev, which has some interesting pieces to it, and then a story about Rav Kook that I think is mind blowing. So, you know what? I'll tell story about Rav Yosef when I get to it as well. So, 9th of Kislev. Rav Kook was asked by the people in Tzfat. So let's remember, there's something called a treifa. A treifa is an animal that has certain physical problems to it. The Gemara expresses it as if a treifa is an animal that by virtue of some kind of a physical wound won't be able to live more than a year. But it's not clear that the Gemara thought that was true. And certainly the Rambam already knows that by his time it's not true. So treifas is a complicated issue because it seems to be about a mortal wound, except that we know the wound isn't actually mortal. So it becomes a matter of tradition. So within that, and because of that, the treifot that we check regularly were reduced in number. The Gemara has a list of like 39 treifot. For most of the treifot in the world, we don't check for them every time. If somebody, when the person kills an animal, we check the lungs. That's well known because that's the glot meat, not glot meat. And that's a matter of checking the lungs and what you do see, what you don't see. But the general experience for, let's say, the brain, where a hole in the membrane of the brain was seen as making a treifa, was that you would open up the head, sort of look casually to see if you saw anything obvious. And if you didn't, you just throw out the brains and then you'd assume the animal was okay. However, in Tzfat, that wasn't their custom. In Tzfat, they had a custom for a while that they would check the brains of large animals as well. So that means, you check the cow, let's say, and you're trying to get the beef out of it. If it ends up being a treifa, right, that's a much bigger loss than a goat. Right? A goat is a small animal. So, but that was their custom. However, the people of Tzfat said to Rav Kook, and what's interesting about this tshuva is it sounds like it's a tshuva about meat and what meat you can eat, what meat you can't eat, except that it's not really about that, because it ends up being a tshuva about when are you allowed to change a custom that your forefathers, right, that your forefathers in that place had undertaken. So the people of Tzfat the Jews of Tzfat came to Rav Kook and said, when this custom developed, it used to be that all the animals were owned by non-Jews, and then Jews would shecht an animal. If the animal was kosher, they would buy that animal from the non-Jew for whatever price they would buy it from the non-Jew. And if it was not kosher, the non-Jew would just take it back and sell it, as non-kosher meat. And the non-Jew didn't care because the non-Jew was either getting slightly more money because the Jews were buying it from him, or the usual amount of money. What does he care? But times have changed now, right? And now the Jews were the ones who owned the animal. So it's still true. If an animal turned out to be a treifa, they could sell it to a non-Jew who would then sell it to his people, but you get a lot less money for it. So the economics were much more difficult. And that's the question they came to him with. So he ends up, in this case, being very stringent about this. There are famous cases where he's very lenient. You can tell me in the chat box, what are two situations where Rav Kook was famously lenient, if you know. Okay, but here, he ends up being stringent because he ends up thinking, and there's a story in the Gemara, it's an interesting question, right? This is one of those interesting halachic questions. The story in the Gemara in Poskim 50b tells the story of these people called the Bnei Baishan, the people of Baishan, or the sons of the Baishan, but they came to Rav Yochanan in the Gemara and said that their forefathers, that their ancestors, wouldn't travel on Fridays outside the city. There was a nearby city. It would be like today. It would be as if today, I don't know where you're all living, but as if today I said, the custom was you didn't travel from Teaneck to Midtown on a Friday because you weren't sure you'd get back in time for Shabbos, right? Or to pick a Jerusalem example, I guess it would be if I said I was going to travel to Vaseret on Shabbos. I'm not going to leave the city of Jerusalem on Shabbos for fear of traffic. So they wouldn't do that. but they had business in that other place, so but they wouldn't go. But now it was hard for them because they weren't as wealthy as they once were. They needed that business. They needed to spend the time doing it. He went to Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan says, "No, you can't do it." So Rav Kook has this whole discussion. I'm not going to spend all the time on the discussion, but Rav Kook basically takes that as a guide to say that even if economic times have changed and you no longer feel like you can make it economically, you nonetheless have to observe the customs that your forefathers laid down in that place. So it ends up being a stringent tshuva, but it raises these very interesting issues about when can we change customs. So somebody says to me in the chat box that correct. One of his big leanings was the heter mechira, although Rav Kook, right, for Shemitah year, the idea that one can sell the land of Israel. Rav Kook was a public proponent of it. It's not his idea though. Really, the original heter mechira came in the late 1800s when the early new settlers of the land, the early new farmers of the land, were struggling tremendously. And Rav Yitzchak Chanan Spector, who was the major authority of his time, and I have a couple of tshuvot in the book from him about that issue, had said that you can rely on the heter mechira. The question always became, he allowed it for that Shemitah. Every new Shemitah, the question becomes, is the economics of it still so fraught that it's permitted to use the heter mechira? So Rav Kook was linked to that and took a lot of flack for it, and then they took everybody was responsible for the Yeshiva flop. So cool. There you go. Wow, you got really early, very much. Yes, I remember. It's true. I also saw somebody said to me, somebody in the chat box who was at the Yeshiva flop was Joel Braverman High School a year or two behind me. I know her well from then, but she said that Rav Harari would teach some of Rabbi Yosef's tshuvot. There were mishmars, I remember, we said tshuvot as well, but not a million of them. So that's one area. The other one was Rav Kook in World War I. I mentioned Rav Uziel. Rav Kook thought you could use sesame seed oil. And he thought that would be a way, and that was a kitniot, and he thought that you were allowed to do that. It was another major leniency that also got him, a lot of blowback from other people of his time. So this tshuva ends up being about this question of when you have a custom that's an established custom, but so Rav Kook talks about the possibility that maybe it was only when the animals belonged to non-Jews. He goes through it all, but can a community change their customs when that custom has become very difficult? Rav Kook, in this instance, was more stringent. There are other cases where Kook is more stringent than other people would have been, but it's just an example of that. Let me, however, not take too much of your time, but let me close with two very fascinating stories. One of them is not from the Responsa, and the other is. So not from the Responsa. I had this beautiful story about Rabbi Yosef that I hope is true. I think it's a well-known story. I'm not sure that it's true, but the story goes that Rabbi Yosef was young, like 8 or 9. He was already clearly on the road to become Rabbi Yosef, and that his Rosh Yeshiva was a man named Rav Ezra Atiyah, who in the story comes off very well. And the story goes that Rav Yosef's father, this isn't a story, this is true. Rav Yosef's father had a store, and the store didn't do great, and the family was very poor. And Rav Yosef says to his Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Ezra Atiyah, I'm not going to be able to come to Yeshiva tomorrow. He says, why? He said, my father told me I have to work in the store. He needs my help in the store. The next morning, Rav Yosef's father shows up to the store, and Rav Ezra Atiyah is there. And he says, what are you doing here? He says, your son told me you need help in the store, and I'm telling you it's more important that I help you in the store than that your son help you in the store. I'm here to help you in the store. So they figured it out. They made other arrangements. I've always thought that was a very beautiful story. But just to finish with Rav Kook, that's what we saw tonight. One of the responses I chose, I forget for which day, was used by, so Rav Kook didn't publish a tremendous amount in his lifetime. He actually, the story goes that when his son said he wanted to start publishing, it was for you to Kook, that Rav Kook wasn't sure why he would publish the stuff. He thought this was like private notes, a lot of it. But one of the early volumes they put out is called Mishpat Haaretz, and it's a series of responsa that Rav Kook wrote about agricultural issues related to the land of Israel. So Rav Kook had a tshuva that he wrote, and I'll talk about when he wrote it in a second, but he had a tshuva that he wrote that uses the introduction to the book. And in the tshuva, he talks about why he's decided to start studying these issues, which after all, aren't really practical halacha for most people because there wasn't huge agriculture in Israel yet. He says, tshuva, it's a whole discussion, but in short and version, he says, that Torah has the quality that when you study it, it comes to life. He means mystically. He means it as a mystical, he calls it a skula. The Torah has the mystical quality. So he says, I want to start studying these halachos as a way for the Torah to come to life.
And what's so interesting about that tshuva is he wrote it in 1894 in Zaimel, where he was the rabbi in Europe at a time when I have no reason to think that he had immediate plans to make Aliyah to move to Israel. And then in 1904, his first father-in-law, his first wife passed away very young. His first father-in-law says to him, "Come to Israel, and I'll get you a job in Israel," and he does. So it's just an example of Kook had this deep belief in the quality of Torah coming to life and being and coming alive. He started studying something that wasn't well studied, and for him it came to life because he came to Israel. He became the chief rabbi. He answered many farmers' questions, and that's the life that he did. So this is the book, Duties of the Poskim, my attempt to understand Shuvot better, to meet, and I did meet, and I hope you'll come and join me and meet many important figures from our halachic literature, learn more about the halachic process of the responsa, and also see more about the themes that are emphasized, that recur over and over again in these responses. Thank you for joining me, and that's what I have to say. I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has them.
Actually, I have a question. I know I'm breaking my own rule by speaking it out and not putting it in the chat. It's just much easier to say it. Can you hear me?
That's it. Yeah, but everybody else thinks that it's easier to say it too. So I don't know what's going to happen.
So I'll set the tone. I'm just wondering about language. I know there's modern Hebrew, there's Loazi. So how were you able to compare and contrast shilas and shuvas if they're written in such different language?
It's interesting. I don't. Now it could be because I wasn't reading the much more modern stuff. Meaning the latest respondent that I dealt with, and not so often, is a man who's still alive, still with us, a man named Pinchas Zvichi. He's a student of Rabbi Yosef's, but they all really write in a rabbinic language. They don't really write modern Hebrew. Meaning, if I would have instead, let's say, read articles from Tchumen, let's say, that would have been written in a modern Hebrew just about Torah issues. These are really written in a rabbinic Hebrew. That's really the language of these chuvot. So somebody asked me the most, right? So is that's your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somebody else asked me in the chat box, what was the most surprising commonality discovered between many and all posts? The least surprised me, the believe in God, right? So believe in God was not. So the answer is, I don't want to steal the book from you, right? But the answer is that now again, you could say it's because I was just interested in these things, but there's the topics that I found most often in the responsa were marriage and money and relationship with non-Jews. So I would not have thought that. I would not have thought that would have been now. So that people have said to me, that's because you were just looking at this and this, but I don't think so. I still don't think so. It's true that as a technical statistical matter, I can't prove to you this is true of response in general. But I did. There's a chapter later in the book where I finally took a really just sort of a random sample or a whatever sample, representative sample, and I found the same thing. So if you said to me that the response to deal with it by marriage, I don't mean only divorce or aguna issues. Certainly not aguna issues in the sense of men refusing to give their wives a get. It appears later in the 20th century, but by and large doesn't appear because for centuries the word aguna did not mean that. The word aguna meant a woman whose husband disappeared. And by disappeared, we don't mean because he's a bad guy. We mean because sadly he got killed somewhere, but not in a way that we're able to identify. That was really what Naguna was. So the fact that so much was about marriage and how you set up marriage, what was a marriage, wasn't a marriage. There's a tshuva once, I think the Rabbi Gidon was once asked about a man walks into a store and he buys something. And let's say he buys something that's worth $4. And he gives the woman a $10 bill. And before she gives him his change, he says to her, with that change that you have in your hand, I'm being Mekadosh you, I'm marrying you. And she's so surprised, she doesn't throw it in his face right away. And the question is, does that maybe count as a Kiddushin? Right? So you have questions like that. And the idea of non-Jews being so significant in the Chuvot, I wouldn't have thought of. So those were the surprising things to me. Do I take into account there are different cultural environments and eras? Right. So the answer is, my goal was not to take into account because my goal was to suggest that these are things that come up regardless of, right, of where they were. That was what I was looking for. I was specifically I was hoping that could say to you, and I can't fully say that, but I was hoping I could say, the Chuvot in the 17th century were not so different than the Chuvot in the 20th century because Torah is Torah and Jews are Jews, whatever. So for an example that I liked a lot, although I didn't use many of his tshuvot I might have liked, the Noda B'Yehud in the late 1700s has many topics that we could easily talk about today. There was a topic of a man got engaged to a woman, right? So an engagement in those days was a huge financial commitment. It wasn't just an engagement; they were like connections. And so he got engaged to her. When he got engaged to her, her grandfather didn't eat kosher. By the time they were going to get married, the grandfather converted to Christianity, and he wanted to break the engagement. And she said he shouldn't have the right to break the engagement, right? So that was a kind of interesting truth about those things. So I think that my goal was to say that much more than we realize, not fully, but much more than we realize, the issues are really very unified and very common across cultural environments here. I did see this one fascinating tshuva. I forget what it's called now. It wasn't a book of tshuvot that I love, but I used it a couple of times. He was clearly a qualified respondent from Jerba. He was a rabbi in Jerba. Jerba is this island off of the coast of Tunisia. And they've had a Jewish community there since, that goes back, I think, literally 2,000 years or more, like and well established and observant, but it's an island. So they're somewhat isolated, particularly before you have television and telephones or whatever. And so he's writing, and somebody writes to him about a tshuva that Rav David Tzvi Hoffman had written in the Malamed Lahovil, I forget the topic now, and says, what do you think of this, or something like that? And he says, well, I haven't heard of this Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, which to me was stunning because, I'm growing up in a world like everybody's sort of David Tzvi Hoffman. So that was interesting in terms of cultural things. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay, in seeing all these tshuvot, did your views of Rabbanim, whether you didn't resonate with change? Separate quickly mentioned. Yes. So Chasam Sofer is a really excellent example. I could be wrong because I didn't see all of his tshuvot, but I came away thinking that he was much more of what we would today call modern Orthodox than people give him credit for. But I could be wrong about that. I could be just letting. But the tshuvot that I saw of his did not feel to me like that. Did not feel to me like somebody writing from this completely cultural of Torah, different culture than what I feel like I grew up in. So that was an example of that. I will say that not that I was surprised by it, and I didn't see so many tshuvot of his. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was somebody who, and I'd sort of always known this because my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Gidon had tremendous respect and reverence for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So it wasn't surprising to me, but it was an example of somebody who you hear of them in one cultural context, and then when you get to know them, it doesn't feel like that at all. And the Tzitz Eliezer, they were friends with each other. Zalman Auerbach was 6 years older, but they were friends with each other. It's another person like that. I wasn't surprised by it, but it was much more than I would have thought. The Tzitz Eliezer felt to me like somebody I could really, really learn from in a sense of being completely comfortable with. He, by the way, I don't remember how I came across this. Oh, I know. I was in somebody's house once, and they had like this copy in the 1950s that Tzitz Eliezer wrote a 3-volume work called Hilchot Medina, because he believed, the 1950s, a man in his 30s, he believed the state of Israel could run by Jewish law. That's not like what we would today sort of characterize like a Haredi view or whatever it was. And he was so excited about it, he wrote a 3-volume work. Now, the family took it out of circulation, but I don't know if you can do it anymore, but it used to be the Hebrew books gave you the options of printing things. They'll print it for you and send it to you if there were copyright issues. So I now own it. So that was an example of somebody who felt more, I don't know if modern is the right word or centrist, but modern or centrist than I would have thought. Okay, somebody was great minds think alike. He addressed this. Yeah, so 1 second. Okay, so many questions. Okay, I'm just going down the chat list. Part of the subtitle thought was great minds think alike. Can you address this? I can. By great minds think alike, what I meant was that when you come out of a world of Torah, you end up having similar, I don't know if it was modes of thinking. I didn't track that so well because they have different writing style. So you want to sit down and try to figure out how they think about things. That was going to be something where it was going to be less easy for me to make it a categorical statement. Meaning if I say this tshuva discusses this topic, so that's a fact. If I say to you, I think they're reaching their conclusions the same way, that's much harder to sort of prove and show. But by think alike, what I meant was that their world of Torah is largely the same. And it's the themes that I mentioned earlier tonight. I did mention this, right? It's the idea that in their world of Torah, so I don't know how many tshuvot Moshe Feinstein answered. I don't think that he published all the tshuvot that he ever answered. I think he published ones he found interesting. Same for the Tzitz Eliezer, it's 26 volumes. It's a massive work. Maybe he did publish everything he ever wrote. I don't know. But people, when they're publishing things that they chose to publish. So the idea that I find them coming around to the same topics over and over again, and the same issues are shaping their thought. That's what I meant about great minds think alike. I meant that when you're a great Torah scholar, it seems like the dominant issues that you're dealing with seem to be similar ones. That's what I meant by that. Okay, so you have questions for me. Oh, well, so I have an email. I have no problem with sharing it, and I'm happy to hear from you. It's my first initial and the first 6 letters of my last name, GROTHST@gmail.com. And then an example of Chasam Sofer Rishon Zalman will be more on nothing. So, I mean, this is a famous one, but Chasam Sofer is a big proponent of the idea that when a miracle happens to a community, that community can make a holiday to celebrate it, like Purim, like Frankfurt had a Purim of its own. So whether you would have applied that to Yom HaAtzmaut or Yerushalayim, I can't tell you because you didn't live to see them happen. But if you don't know the politics around it and you read the tshuva, you certainly thinking to yourself that he might have been in favor, maybe not of Hallel, maybe yes of Hallel, but certainly of a holiday to celebrate the day and to commemorate the day going forward. I had a couple of years ago. It's going to be 2 Yom Yerushalayim ago. I was talking to a young man who's from a particular group of Hasidus that's not such fans of the state of Israel. And it was Yom Yerushalayim, and there was some big, celebration going on in the street of Jerusalem. And he says to me, this is just ridiculous. It's just silly. What are they celebrating? I'm thinking, what are you talking about? This happens to be, you go to the Kotel all the time. And without the 6-day war, you wouldn't have been able to go there. Nothing there. So that. So the Chasam Sofer's tshuva seems to be made clear, regardless of whether we've had Yom Hallel or not Hallel, this or that, he would have thought and he would have thought it was a biblical obligation to establish a day to celebrate something like that. Rav Shlomo Zalman about that, I don't have anything in particular that comes to mind. Let's Eliezer much more was somebody who also is thought of as being from that more right-wing Haredi-ish kind of world, and yet is very much not. And I'll tell you, they're just the surprising things. These aren't surprising things like more religious, more right-wing, less right-wing. But 2 things that strike me just now as you asked me the question that he said. One was, he said when he was growing up in Jerusalem, when they would pass a mosque, we today accurately and correctly say, well, Muslims are clearly monotheist, and therefore, in some sense, their religion is much closer to us than other non-fully monotheist religions, which is true. But he said that when he was growing up in Jerusalem, they were always taught that if it's another religion, you can't look. You're supposed to, if you're walking by a place of their worship, you should turn away. And they used to say something. I forget what. And they would say something as they walk by to not be part of that. The other thing that I thought was interesting was he was asked once by a doctor. Doctor was living in the old city of Jerusalem and wanted to move, I think, to Efrat. And the question came up about Shabbos, right? In the old city of Jerusalem, he's able to get to the hospital much easier, and there wouldn't be as much Chil Shabbos, and this and this and this. And can he move to, I don't think it was Yarok Yarak, I think it was Shakit to Shakatin, I'm not sure. But this doctor wants to know, can he move to Efrat about Shabbos issues? So it goes through the Shabbos issues, and can you use the hospital as a non-Jew? Will drive you. What do you do about that? Whatever. It goes through the whole thing. But he says, but if you're willing to not move, because the doctor had said to him, if you tell me I should move, I'll tell you that if you're living in the old city, I don't think you're allowed to move out of the old city, which was surprising to me because I never heard such a thing. He thought that if you're living in the old city, there might be an Isser prohibition to move out of the old city. That was a surprising thing that I told to Eliezer. If you want to explore this topic further, there's nothing else to read. I'm the one who created the field. What do you mean? How can you ask me to? So the truth is, there are lots of people who do lots of work on Responsa. I'm just trying to think of. There's a guy named Eli Fisher who has a project where he's doing data sampling of Responsa for a different purpose that I'm trying to get. You're trying to figure out which respondents were speaking with whom, like what was the geography of Responsa, who was writing to who, was not writing to him. So his name is Eli Fisher. I forget the name of the project, but I think if you just look him up online, you can find where he does stuff like that. But many people have done things. I mean, there's, let's say, a biography of Moshe Feinstein by a guy named Harel Gordon that delves into the Responsa very, very deeply. But I think most people who use the Responsa use it to get a picture of a person or a picture of an area rather than a picture of Responsa or of Torah in general, the way I was trying to do. Anybody else? Questions, comments, concerns?
Okay.
All right, well, that's for me.
Well, if they have more questions, they have your email.
They
And
do.
if you don't mind, I'm going to be emailing everybody when we have the recording of this. So I could just remind them how to get in touch with you.
Great.
And this was amazingly riveting. You have a title for a book and a book talk, and you don't know, you can't judge a book talk by its cover.
There you go.
It was really great. So thank you so much, and
All
thank you
right. Thank
everybody
you
for
all.
coming. And we
All
should
right.
just
Have a good night, everybody.
say,
All right. Just last question in the chat box. First thing I tell someone, if you I wanted to inform them about your book, but they may not know. I don't know the first thing I would say. The first thing I would say is that we have this rich literature written by these great scholars where they put together the information that they've absorbed and they manage to collate it into answers to specific questions, which isn't always a skill that everybody has. I guess that's the first thing. But I don't know, maybe not. Depends on the person. That's it. That's what I really should have said. I would be careful enough to first get to know the person well, know what they need to hear, and then I would say to them something for them. All right. That's it for me. Have a good night,
okay,
everybody. Thanks for
thank
coming.
you. Good night.
Be well. Good night.